Hello, everyone. Um, I'll start with a bow to each of you. So this is a lecture on the history of DSM, and I'll just to say that I'm also going to post. I'm posting also in addition to this little lecture, a brief outline of what I'm talking about. So you can also look at that and trace some of this there. And also, I'm posting PDF copies of DSM 1 and 2. So the original documents in PDF format, DSM 1 and 2. So you can take a look at those as well if you're curious what DSM 1 looked like, DSM 2 looked like. So those two will be available and from all the way from 1950s starting. Just to let you know that I have notes here in front of me, so I will probably keep looking down and up. I'm not sure if you need to look at the video overall. Sometimes maybe just listening to it actually might make it more beneficial for you. So it's entirely up to you, of course. So a couple of lenses in looking, couple of reasons why we look at the history and lenses as we look at the history. Maybe that would be good to talk about. Um, uh, I think some of what I'm going to share might answer or begin to discuss why does it exist? Why does DSM exist? Why has it existed and how did it come about? That's maybe one of the questions that we begin to engage. There's no maybe one answer, but then how was it developed? How does it continue to change? Maybe that's one of the inquiry. Uh, some of the more detailed things, lenses will be looking at different factors that impact the development and change in DSM, such as economic factors, historically, when did economic factors start influencing as an external force? In general, we divide the influence, we could divide, one lens could be intradisciplinary forces such as, within psychiatry and definitions and practices within the mental health system and counseling and so forth. And then external forces could be economical factors, and wars have impacted DSM, certainly. And also pharmaceuticals, use of pharmaceuticals and government legislation and laws that passed in terms of who can have access and how people can have access to mental health treatment. Those are some of the external forces that keep shifting, of course, the DSM. We'll track a little bit of the orientations. When I say orientations, what I mean is that sometimes DSM uses more categorical, as I think we talked about already a little bit, so, categorical orientation or dimensional orientations, but also sometimes it has focused more on treatment and more context, and then sometimes more symptomology, actually looking at symptoms. And then also sometimes it's more research oriented. So that's how it was. And one of the orientations is statistical, actually. So making lists and statistics, coming up with statistics, that kind of thing. Another lens we'll look is try to situate it a little bit internationally, worldwide. Where is DSM and how does it impact with other systems in the world? World Health Organization has the International Categorization of Diseases, ICD, so we'll talk a little bit about that. And then critical views of critical understanding, meaning that you can relate to it with critical thinking. That what are its impacts, beneficial impacts, harmful impacts, and it's of course on a continuum like that. And then hopefully this will allow you to begin to find your relationship to it. Your relationship to DSM will have many different dimensions, I'm sure, in terms of diagnosing, understanding diseases and disorders, and historical impacts, and social impacts, and accessibility, and its use as actually a tool for oppression, certainly. And so those could be many different ways that you relate and that you find your relationship. I hope it's complex, and I hope you expand and expand and not get actually kind of not get situated in one lens and then stay there and hold that just primarily. So maybe we can start with the history. The history is um, in in the mid 1800s in the U.S. And I'll say that this history, of course, DSM is a U.S. based document, so this history tracks mostly the development within the U.S. So just to acknowledge that. The um, the first beginnings of collecting data about people's experiences on mental health, on a mental health continuum, started in mid 1800s, and in 1840 there was a census. Census meaning they collected data from they're counting people, right? So counting people and counting experiences, and the census usually has questions like, how many people live in your household, and ages, and who's married, and professions, sometimes other demographic information, and so forth. So in 1840, the census gathered also first time data around mental illnesses. And there was only one category, and it was called idiocy/insanity. Idiocy, insanity. So, and there was no definition of it, but idiocy is the word idiot, right? So idiot comes from that. So there was some data that got collected around this. However, very soon, a couple of years after, the American Statistical Association make official complaints and protests to U.S. House of Representatives that there were errors in this already. There were errors in this counting, this conceptualization. In many places, one of the problems that we're actually seeing in the census is that in many towns across the United States, for example, African Americans were counted as they were actually simply because of their color of skin, they were counted as insane. They were under this category. So there are some historical, really important things here, because this is actually 1840s, 1850s in the U.S. history is where things really became intense around racial relationships, and between what today maybe is called as Southern states, the Confederate States, and the Union, the Northern states, around abolition of slavery. So this became really a time where discussion around race became very prevalent, especially around between this binary designation between black and white. Um, at this time in 1851, I want to give you an example. There was actually a mental illness that was proposed by a physician. His name is Samuel Cartwright. He proposed a mental illness that was called drapetomania. Drapetomania. This was actually um, uh, this was uh, um, I'm giving you this example because it is so um, such a good example of how sometimes mental health diagnoses were simply created or used to oppress, to utilize for certain purposes, for certain political, economic purposes. So this is an important example. Drapetomania was this idea that if a slave runs away from captivity, that this doesn't make sense because they were considered happy and they were considered well taken care of, and slaves who ran away from captivity, it was proposed that they would be given this diagnosis of insanity. And of course, this proposal by this physician did not was not at all considered as a serious proposal by folks who were in these discussions. But it's an example of how people were observing, conceptualizing, diagnosing others for their own personal and economic benefits sometimes. Another view at the time, this is really, I'm again giving an example around on this racial continuum. Another view was at the time, actually, other people also felt like slaves were immune to mental illness, actually. Slaves were immune to mental illness because they did not own property. They did not participate in commerce or civic affairs such as voting and public office, holding public office, and so forth. So uh, these show you how at the beginnings of this there was some actually interaction between looking at mental illness and race, and this continued within U.S. history and continues to this day in different ways, not only around race, but of course other identities, other populations as well. Now, 1861 and 1865 are the years of civil war in the U.S. And civil war is, of course, a time where this question around slavery, this really took over the whole consciousness of the country and the population in the U.S. It's interesting that that right after that is actually the first beginnings of DSM, the first inklings of DSM started emerging. In 1871, the American Medical Association published its nomenclature of diseases. This is a first overall list of diseases. It didn't only include mental health, but it was a general list of diseases, and it also included the diseases of the intellect. However, this was short-lived and didn't really continue. This conceptualization didn't continue. 1880 was another year of census, and at this time, 7 categories were already developed for mental illness. These were mania, melancholia, which was a name for depression, is as we understand today a little more. That's how it was conceptualized. Monomania, Monomania was conceptualized as and the way that it was talked about was insanity in one area for a short, maybe short-lived or partial insanity in one area. And example was kleptomania, which is around stealing. So um, uh, Paresis was another one. This is motor weakness or partial paralysis, dementia, deterioration of memory, judgment, and emotional regulation. Dipsomania was alcoholism, and epilepsy, disturbances in electric charge of brain cells, epilepsy. So these were the 7 categories that 1880 census that adopted and statistically looked at in the at this time, idiocy and insanity were dropped from the language at this time. In historically sort of placing everything, 1895 is when Sigmund Freud and Joseph Breuer published Theories of Unconscious Mind and also studies of hysteria. So the beginnings of psychoanalytic, psychodynamic movements in Europe started in 1895. In 1899, German psychiatrist Emil Kraepelin distinguished between schizophrenia and manic depressive psychosis. So he was doing some research and understanding about schizophrenia and manic depressive psychosis. He also talked about dementia as actually he was using the word dementia as precursor to schizophrenia. The one interesting thing about Kraepelin that gets talked about in the history is that he actually was working in a mental health institution, in an asylum at the time, and he was noticing commonalities among his patients. So he started looking at commonalities and trying to identify. Therefore, he tried to identify and come up with some categories that he observed people would fit in. So this is the beginnings of this kind of categorical commonalities of actually experiences and symptoms. So if you think about today's DSM, that's what it's trying to do, commonalities. It looks at statistically, to people's experiences, and then those common experiences are categorized into a diagnosis, basically. There's another lens that in this whole there's another lens in this whole trajectory, which is looking at symptoms versus looking at symptoms only, and versus looking at context and course of a disease, which actually course of a disease is also really different because you see some symptoms, but then at different times it could show the symptoms could change, the experience could change course, and then also often there is sometimes ends. It's a cessation of those experiences, maybe for a period of time, maybe it repeats again. So today, when we talk about depression, for example, major depression, we talk about episodes. Episodes arise, and then people go through those episodes. If we go with that diagnostic conceptualization, that's how we think about it. There are episodes; they last a certain amount of time, and then maybe they don't come back for some time, and then it comes back again, perhaps. So looking at symptoms in the moment versus looking at the development of an experience, of a mind state, and then the context in it, in which it develops, and then of course its cessation. So these are some of the different ways that DSMs and other attempts to actually look at to talk about diseases, that these were some of the different ways that they looked. The DSM today encompasses all of that. That's what the attempt. It's making an attempt to actually bring in symptoms, and then how it changes, and the context where it arises. It tries. It's very limited in that regard, but it tries to touch into that, and then also talks about cessation of it, and how that might happen. So in the turn of the 20th century, in the 1900s, the symptom-based view started dying, and then more looking at the context and more looking at the trajectory of an illness, and then cessation of it. Those were more the interests that people had to look at that. I want to say a few things at the time about different orientations to these categorical sort of lists, and different people published basically different things. It's understood that the asylums, this is the time of still asylums, institutions, and there were prevalent institutions and physicians in these institutions, and across the world, European more countries, and the US, who actually really had their own. They published. They did their own. They published their own. One of those examples is a French physician in 1893. His name is Jacques Bertillon. He introduced the Bertillon classification of causes and death, and actually even presented this in Chicago to the International Statistical Institute. So this was this was considered in the U.S. As a system, categorization system to be used. In 1900, this Bertillon classification was expanded upon in the U.S. And people started having conferences about these, and it was a major movement in terms of categorization. Another one, for example, is 1903, the Bellevue Hospital in New York, which was actually one of the important hospitals, mental health hospitals. And this hospital published a list of diseases and conditions, and included a section of diseases of the mind. And again, revisions were done in 1909 and then 1911. And of course, this actually was used to the next census. This actually informed the next census. Again, around this time, 1900, Freud published The Interpretation of Dreams. And this actually, at this time, he started developing the talking cure. So the beginnings of psychotherapy in the form in the European form that we know today, the beginnings of this. And this was about looking at early experiences, intrapsychic factors, and unconscious, and so forth. This began a movement from more from an asylum, from a mental institution, to more psychotherapy, and this is a development in the U.S. from 1900s, also from 1920s, I would say, from 1920s into the 50s, 60s, where the asylums started. The people who were in asylums and mental health hospitals, the numbers declined, and other forms of treatment started happening. 1914, 1919, This is around and after World War One. Actually, talk therapy was used to work with veterans who were coming back from the war, and the term shell shock was used. Shell shock, and this is the early conceptualization of PTSD. Um, uh, so one of the interesting things is with psychodynamic, psychoanalytic orientation becoming more prominent in the US, actually made more folks who were in treatment not to care so much about diagnosis because they were not necessarily looking at symptoms in that sense to categorize, to understand in that way, because the understanding was already these were unconscious and there was a cure, so talk therapy, and we're going to engage, we're going to be in relationship and engage. And so clinicians did not pay attention to diagnosis, and that wasn't a mindset. However, researchers started, so this is a division between clinicians sometimes and researchers. So and over the history, so I'll talk a little bit about this, over the history of DSM and mental health, treatment in the US, um, really politically, sometimes research, more scientific research orientation had more power, and then sometimes more the treatment clinicians, more relational approaches had more power. This translates to categorical, not exactly directly, but pretty much overlaps with then the scientific being a little more categorical, and then the treatment oriented, relationship oriented folks, clinicians, being more dimensional orientation to understanding diseases. 1917, there was actually an association, American Psychiatric Association, and there was a National Commission of Mental Hygiene. In the 20s, there was a mental hygiene movement that emerged, and uh, mental hygiene movement uh, is actually really interesting because it actually also is the beginnings of the counseling field, in the sense that it was more practical. It talked about having outpatient clinics. They started having outpatient clinics. They looked at different particular practical applications of working with people, such as child rearing, child guidance centers for parenting, treatment facilities for colleges, in colleges and schools, and vocational explorations. And so this was moving away to working with extreme states, which the beginnings of this history was a little more about extreme states in asylums, and but actually this was promoting mental health, positive experiences, and alleviating stressful conditions, and then also adapting to social conditions and social environments. So supporting people to adapt. So the mental hygienist movement. 1940s, Veterans Administration became really important in this, in actually broadening categories and working with, and of course, this is the World War II situation at that time. Um, Veterans Administration really saw that people were impacted by the war, and both in serving as soldiers in the war, veterans, combat vets, but also other parts of the population were impacted. So I'm going to jump in here. By this time, so we're talking about 1940, 1945. At this time, the international categorization of diseases published by World Health Organization, WHO, this was already in its actually sixth version, and they included actually the difference. One of the main differences between ICD and DSM is DSM only looks at mental illness and some other conditions that impact mental illness. But ICD is a broad categorization of all illnesses, medical illnesses, and then it has a chapter 5, I believe, on mental disorders. So at this time, already ICD-6 was, and there was actually some connection between what was happening in the U.S. with Veterans Administration in the U.S. and so the developments of that were coming from Veterans Administration and the proposals were incorporated in ICD-6. So there was actually on and off, this is another trajectory that one can really research, on and off at different times in the history, World Health Organization and American Psychological Association, they collaborated, sometimes they didn't collaborate, they were doing their own thing, they separated in certain areas, and then they sometimes also came together. In the US, sometimes when a new ICD was published, sometimes the US took it and they published their own revision of it. And so they adopted it, but they changed it a little bit and they published a revision from it, basically. So let's see, I'm going to move forward. There was actually, this is interesting if you are interested in, this kind of specific history. In 1945, the War Department in the US published a technical bulletin, and this was called Medical 203. It's a pretty well-known document, and it was the nomenclature and method of recording diagnoses. This was published, and this became actually also available for civilian use in 1946. Medical 203, it's called, and it really informed also DSM-1 in the creation of DSM-1. So this is interesting for us to know that actually the beginnings of this also has military background. And if you can imagine that sometimes big leaps, all of a sudden quick developments around mental health services, diagnosis, understanding, conceptualization happened after large events such as wars and famines, and COVID actually showed us a big development also in the mental health fields. All of a sudden, new laws and new regulations passed quickly to be able to meet the needs of people. I'm not going to talk about this so much, but you can look it up if you like. For example, talking about census reports and surveys, the Center for Diseases and Control, CDC, has actually done a big census survey right after COVID about impacts of COVID on mental health, excuse me. So that's actually published, that you can take a look at it. It focuses on depression and anxiety, and very quickly it was disseminated online. People participated, and then it was used to really create policy in certain places to treat immediately, to understand what is happening to folks around COVID-19, for example. So those are some of the pushes that happened in the history in different ways. those are some of the external factors like that. Another trajectory that one can really look at, so there's so many different things overlapping here and of course talking to each other. National Institute of Mental Health, NIMH in the US. I'm including the link of its history here also in the text that you can look at. This is also really interesting because it shows what the government has done. The presidents signed. Presidents really were influential in this. Of course, I mean they take the credit, I guess, but other people have done it. Oops. Sorry about that. The light is shifting. So. The National Institute of Mental Health was actually developed first it developed 1946. So with President Harry Truman. So this of course changed over time, but I want to read to you the National Institute of Mental Health goals as it's published today. Today, it has 4 overarching goals. The first goal, this is really important because it shows us where we've come and what the orientation is today toward mental health. The first goal is defining the brain mechanisms underlying complex behaviors. So immediately, right away, this mental, we're trying to look at the brain mechanisms. It's a scientific, chemical, what is happening chemically in the brain. And then goal 2 is examine mental illness trajectories across the lifespan. Goal 3 is striving for prevention and cures. And then goal 4 is strengthening the public health impact of NIMH, National Institute of Mental Health, and supported research. It's supported research. So when research is done, then it actually is published and it advocates for it actually to be included in legislation, and so it has more impact. This is important in that sense. Let's see, 1952. So now we're coming to DSM-1 slowly. 1952 is the first publication of the DSM. And this was adapted for, in connection with ICD-6. It actually also had some goal to make it utilitarian for clinicians also, but mainly in mental health hospitals. So this was really trying to understand what is happening in mental health hospitals, who is there, how do we categorize what's happening. And also it had the view that mental disorders had a biological foundation. Let's see. 1963 marks the first time a US president actually gave a speech to the Congress, a message about mental health issues. This was February 5th, 1963. Kennedy gave a special message to the Congress around the importance of mental health issues. DSM, for the first DSM, it took about 10-15 years. It received feedback, of course, and DSM-2 was developed. Work started immediately, of course. Always when the publication happens, work continues to update it. So that's been steady until today. It continues. DSM-2 was published in 1968, and this overlaps with the publication of ICD-8 at this time. So one of this um, is interesting. Um, Sometimes certain terminology you can trace in the DSM that really shows us how people thought about things. Um, um, uh, there was a difference between DSM 1 and 2, and one could argue some of the impacts in thinking. The word reaction was removed from DSM 2. It was in DSM 1, and reaction to something, right? So in reaction to something, this mental state is observed. So you can see that the reaction conceptualization actually is more relational and more contextual. And removing this um, uh, uh, actually changed the view. It was then less seen as psychological, social, and biological factors, um, and um, more. The term neurosis was actually still retained, neurosis, and this is more this is more personal. This is more individual rather. So that it actually showed a little bit of that kind of view. The DSM-2 also by this time, 1968, psychodynamic orientation was really included. It informed. This is also again intrapsychic, very much looking at one's own intrapsychic development, one's past and shadow and unconscious and so forth. Excuse me. Um, the DSM-2 did not have a lot of detail in terms of actually where the boundaries were between when we call something a disorder, when we not call something a disorder. It was more descriptive, more dimensional, but less clear also at the same time. So this is actually really interesting because the more we try to go dimensional and more descriptive of people's experiences, one critique of that is that we lose clarity of these categorizations. So we live on this continuum always in terms of, and from a Buddhist point of view, we also are very much practicing um, uh, being with experience. So being with experience fully, which is actually more it's a more descriptive, like really being with the fullness of experience, and perhaps an insight that comes, clear seeing that comes out of that. And then we also practice not to hold on to that clear seeing as a solid reality. It arises and it changes and right. So that's sort of the practice that we do. And of course, this overlaps for me in my mind. This has been the tension in the DSM. It continues to be the tension. 1986, so ICD-8, as I mentioned, um, and then um, Fraser Carroll in your reading talks about how at this time, schizophrenia in DSM-2, some of the criteria of schizophrenia were hostile and aggressive. Hostility and aggression were part of the criteria. And this, uh, the author really makes a point that uh, this overlapped with the conceptualization and the stereotype of Black people in the US and Britain in Europe, of violence and criminality, and the social dynamics around race, as this was arising, um, that all of a sudden Black people started being diagnosed with schizophrenia. Again, this is a way to, put people in a category to relate to push away, to judge, to oppress. This kind of thing happened on and off, certainly. Um, so 1970s, now we come to 1970s. I'm going a little bit slow here, but I'm not going to be too much longer. 1970s uh, saw the development, the shift into more research. So researchers started becoming more powerful in their orientation to DSM and in their impact on DSM. Um, um, And this is really interesting for us also to think about because, right, so Naropa was founded in 1974, as you might know, and then CPVP started again in that decade. And the most influential person who really came to Naropa and was a student of Chogyam Trungpa's was Ed Podwell, who we are going to study. And he was actually a psychoanalyst and he worked in mental health institutions and hospitals, and so he really did. So we are still in this program in our relationship to counseling and how we think about diagnosis, and we are also impacted by this lineage, certainly, that he brought more psychodynamic, more descriptive, more relational, more sometimes we also call it symptoms are more visible on the surface, but then the how symptoms develop and the unconscious perhaps or social dynamics and so forth are more in-depth way of looking. So instead of looking just at symptoms and therefore categorizing this in this way, we are oriented toward more dimensional and also more in-depth, sometimes one could say. And that's not in-depth versus surface, symptoms. This is not right or wrong. It's not, the binary could be actually not so beneficial because both of those actually are needed in understanding a person's experience. But this program has that kind of view. Sometimes it is said that we are learning in-depth psychology or psychotherapy, in-depth counseling, as opposed to just symptom relief kind of orientation. Let's see. So 1970s, this is actually the first time. It's also really interesting to note that 1970s was the first time neuroimaging became possible. So neuroimaging actually became possible, and they started being able to look at the brain specifically, and in different states they were able to take images of the brain, and we see this, and there is actually some longitudinal studies around this even today. And one of the challenges is that brain changes every moment, and relationship is what changes brain in the moment so much. And then we can see long-term effects of something, of course, too. But brain changes so much, so it's been challenging to really come up with some real outcomes that are repeatable, or so we're a little bit still in the dark, I would say, in terms of our relationship to brain, how we can track, and all of that. But that view started, and research and scientific view in the 1970s. 1970s also marks the time when more and more people were taken out of mental institutions in the US. And because different funding was needed, and also it was established that the institutions were not so helpful. But this also started causing people who were houseless, and and incarceration. So these are the beginnings of those also those social impacts that started in the 70s, late 70s. I was mentioning to you that external forces sometimes impacted the DSM. 1970s also sees that there was a movement, strong movement from various different organizations and groups. Homosexuality was still a diagnosis in the DSM as an illness, and there was a huge movement. This was actually one of the first big, more lobbying movements by the public to say, you need to change this, you need to change DSM. So this external actually really impact started coming in. And then another external impact was the, again, Veterans Administration on and off with different research that they and experiences and conceptualizations and experiences, their observations that they brought great influence into how DSM was conceptualized. Another impact, maybe I should say it now, is the pharmaceutical industry really started to impact DSM because they started promoting drugs for these diseases. It was more the chemical model, and then at some point, this happened more in the 1990s, and at some point, of course, how mental health treatment, who can have access and who can get support from the government for mental health treatment and insurance companies. So this got really locked in terms of today, the reality that we have, the impact on DSM is huge in that sense, that between DSM-1 and between DSM-2, there was an 800% increase in the number of diagnoses. So that's another thing we can trace. So this also shows us how, how these external forces really impacted. We want people to be able to receive the care and the funding, and that's what DSM serves at the moment. And it's really a twisted sort of system. 1980, DSM-3 was published, and this overlaps with ICD-9. DSM-3 is actually really more, it's a much wider and extended book in that sense. It actually had more explicit diagnostic criteria. It brought multi-axis system, and it had more descriptive approach also, and neutrality of theoretical orientation. So this is really interesting because no longer it was more psychodynamically oriented. So it actually removed itself from theoretical, more neutral theoretically. And that would be really interesting to really look at some of the diagnoses, disorders and criteria, and how that actually really shifted. That would be really interesting. And then it was developed, again, also the attempt was to include both support for clinicians. It actually had the view that this could be used for clinicians, but also for researchers. So it started also expanding into that. And this is the DSM-3 is where really it opened up. The diagnostic criteria really opened up pharmaceutical companies to become more prevalent in this picture. So there are institutes in the US that promote legislation, that talk about legislation, and these are public institutes and groups that basically advocate and lobby for legislation, for different care and all of that. And many and their goal is to increase accessibility and so forth. And in the US at the moment, one research shows that 3/4 of funding that comes to these institutions, these public institutions that support mental illness legislation and discussions, 3/4 of the funding actually is given by pharmaceuticals. So there are histories. You can go in and you can go into some Google about this, and you can find out, how within these institutions, even pharmaceutical companies lobby, and they have so much impact on what happens. 1980 was when also President Carter signed the Mental Health Systems Act, 1980. So this is an important act, Mental Health Systems Act. This is important because it actually created this whole funding source for mental illness treatment, and it's really connected federal government with states and local partnerships, and the focus was preventing mental illness. This started the Community Mental Health Center program, basically, Community Mental Health Center program. I want to say to you that I was, privileged to have worked at the mental health, what was used to be called Boulder County Mental Health Center. Now it's called Boulder County, Boulder, I can't remember now what it's called, but Recovery Center or something like that. I think the largest mental health institution here in Boulder. For some reason, the name escaped me at the moment. This was a very major force in the 80s and 90s in Boulder County. Very strong agency, and Naropa has huge impact also in this, connecting communities. Mental health center used to have homes where mentally ill people could live and get treatment, and so it was such a community orientation and organization, and very positive impact. I think I came to the tail end of that really when I was working there in 2004, 2005 through 2007 probably. So and then it has become a little more corporate, a little more more now the normative dominant mental health agency, less community oriented. Still, I think they've tried to bring that, but so these are also interesting because those different orientations in agencies also relate to use of DSM, how people use DSM and what they do. And I want to say at any time, please, of course, stop this and take a break. So because I keep going on, and I'm going to go on another 10-15 minutes, I believe, and then it will be done. So this is so we're in 1980 Mental Health Systems Act. 1981 another president came to presidency and actually repealed the Mental Health Systems Act. So this is another example, like how political movements and lobbying and different interests that have more power impact what happens. And in 1 year, something can change all of a sudden, and it can really impact our profession, where funding comes, how we relate to diagnosis, how we relate to treatment planning, all of that. So this is really important. So this actually, the repealing of the Mental Health Act gave more power to states. So again, the funding source changed, how it's packaged changed, and actually it shifted the federal government's role. It limited the federal government's role in working with states and with mental health institutions. You can see this, as I mentioned, I'm going to include the link here. You can see the link there also about this history. 1987, DSM-3 was revised and published as DSM-3R revised. So that's where R comes from. And since then, we've had that. The revision included, some inconsistent. It got rid of some inconsistencies, and then also some of the criteria that were criticized by not being clear were more clarified. There was an attempt to clarify. Another 7 years passed. 1994, DSM-4 was published. The DSM-4 really marks a shift in how actually the diagnoses, the criteria were conceptualized much, much more robustly based on research, empirical studies of mental disorders. Actually, much more research was done now in the last 10 years before 1994, and the DSM included results of those research. More, again, effort was made to actually be descriptive in terms of diagnoses, in terms of criteria. Now, but this description, so this description was more the personal experience of the person, as opposed to the symptom of the observing of the symptom of the sign, but actually more what the person was describing in terms of. I forgot to mention one thing earlier when I was talking about the external forces. So if we look at this, how external forces have impacted shaping the DSM, one example, we can look at different examples, but one example that gets talked about is, for example, personality disorders is a section of the DSM, of this whole conceptualization, where pharmaceuticals have no impact. They have not done research. They have not contributed, participated. They have no interest because there is no medication that could treat personality disorders or change the symptoms. I mean, some symptoms can be altered for sure. Some things can happen, but as a general orientation, where there is a medication for depression, as we can say, the symptoms of that at large, there is no medication for personality disorders. So this is actually a major important acknowledgement that they stayed largely outside. So scientific, that kind of scientific process based toward medication stayed outside of conceptualizing how we conceptualize personality disorders. This was much more about than descriptive. It remains descriptive of people's experiences. And another important change in DSM-4, which then remains till today, is that that actually the diagnoses had to be based on significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other areas of functioning. So this is really important, that criteria, that formulation remains today. And while that formulation can be helpful for someone who actually really might having a hard time functioning in certain ways that they would like to be able to function. But the context of that inability or that particular experience is not really looked at so much. So it's till today, if actually I'm not able to function, and I think this was the basically Martin Luther King's speech that we listened in the class that Lauren brought to us. If I'm not able to function, or if I'm not willing to function in this socially normative way, what is that? Is this my diagnosis, or is this a symptom of what is happening at large in the culture? That question is not really being asked. So that's an important point for us to actually look at that. So DSM-4 also brought some brevity of criteria sets, so it's shorter. The language is clearer, and it really started actually categorizing, also not categorizing, but it has the headings that the headings started being developed in terms of how we look at a diagnosis. What are some of the other paragraphs that in addition to the criteria, other paragraphs started developing. And then it also really brought the multi-axial system, is what we call. This is no longer used. So DSM-4 had this, and then we no longer use that. But it actually did discriminate between, distinguish between what we call clinical disorders, and then personality disorders, then medical issues, and psychosocial issues. So it was a five-part multi-axial system: clinical disorders, personality disorders, medical issues, psychosocial issues, and what is called GAF score of a person, global assessment of functioning. And sometimes this included childhood factors as well. So if you think about this, this is interesting because it is trying to really bring in the psychosocial factors in fully understanding a person. So you would look at a person and you would actually really try to be descriptive around this five. You would look at all these five axes and then try to understand a person. And it's interesting that personality disorders were kept as a distinct axis because, again, they were descriptive, they were considered not a clinical disorder, but a personality disorder, so hence the name like that. So again, I will say from DSM-1 to DSM-4, there was an 800% increase in the number of psychiatric diagnoses. So this took about basically half a century if you think about it. So in 1951 to 1994, a little more than 40-something years, it took to include 800% more diagnoses that we work with, and also today. 1999 was when ICD-10 was developed and published, and ICD-10, and this was actually adopted in the U.S. also as as part of that. 2000s are important because 2000s are the time when more genetic research became very prevalent, and understandings of genetic factors in some of the mental disorders, genes that would be activated, and so we'll talk about that more in the class. But this has also shifted our view in terms of etiology, the causes of mental illnesses. So there's been so much research on schizophrenia with genes, and there is the likelihood, the prevalence of, there's a lot of studies, family studies around schizophrenia experience, psychosis experience, because this is seen in families repeating in different ways. So does this happen with genes? Does this happen with other environmental factors? Those are questions that we try to continue. DSM in 2000, DSM-4 TR text revision was introduced, and this actually, one of the reasons was this text revision was introduced was because the literature review that was considered in creation of DSM-4 only was going till 1992. So now we have really, so the research actually exponentially grew at this time, of course, more. And so this became really important for this revision and new incorporation of new literature and mostly research outcomes. And then they claim that this change, this TR, was really all the changes were based on empirical data. All the changes were based on empirical data. So this process began in 1997 and then was completed in 2000. In 2007, APA announced the task force that would oversee the development of DSM-5. This was 27 members of a task force, and it included scientists from psychiatry, clinical care providers, consumers, and family advocates. And so it actually really broadened the community that would really review this document, give feedback, and also incorporate lit reviews and research, all of that. There were 13 conferences, over 400 researchers who participated in the end, and many thousands of field trials, tests, and reliability studies. So it's very heavily empirical based in that sense. And then DSM-5 was published in 2013. So this took basically about from 2000 to 2013, basically from TR, DSM-4 TR to DSM-5, it took more than 10 years for it to be published. DSM-5 made the attempt to use more a spectrum, more a continuum of disorders. The illness is a continuum and it's not a fixed experience. The word spectrum was used for the first time in the DSM with DSM-5. So DSM-5 also marks a very important shift because so far I had mentioned to you that DSM-3 was now no longer theoretical, but neutral theoretically. DSM-5 now marks another shift in this, and it became theoretical again toward more chemistry, what we call biological reductionism, and which means the view that the disorders are because of brain pathology, more looking at chemical, more looking at brain science. So it became theoretical again with DSM-5. It got rid of the axes, one of the interesting things about the axes is some people, some critiques and some researchers talk about this. The axes actually allowed a more fuller maybe experience of a fuller experience of the a person, and less medical. Maybe it actually moves a little bit, and you will not really study this since we're not doing this anymore. But when I first was introduced to DSM, I had to study the axes and do the 5 axes and all of that. It was a more fuller sort of experience. It was an attempt. I mean, was it perfect? Of course not. But and then moving away from the axes is seen as more a medical approach. Basically, we have already these diseases, we have the categories, we have the brain chemistry sort of thinking and model, and we're just going to use that. Another interesting thing, these are maybe minor but important things. DSM, um, you'll notice that DSM-5, with DSM-5, the number 5 is used as actually an Arabic numeral. So what we call those are, the numbers 1 through, the actual 1, 2, 3, those numbers are called Arabic numerals. Whereas the one using IV, V being 5, is the Roman numerals. So there was a shift in DSM-5. There was a decision to actually move to Arabic numerals. And this also overlaps with a more scientific kind of language and usage of language. The first chapter, if you look at DSM-5, the first chapter, the first word is neurological. So this actually, I use this, of course, a lot, nervous system, neurological regulation, all of that. But neuro in this sense is really to denote brain chemistry and neurological. So that's really the orientation. The first word in the first chapter is neuro. It shifted the language from mood disorders to actually the actual. It describes the language. It used to have a whole chapter of mood disorders. Now we don't have that anymore. We have depression related disorders, that kind of thing. 95%, it's considered that 95% of the changes from DSM-4 text revision to DSM-5 are about more leniency, meaning more people would be diagnosed, more wider experiences would be able to fit into a diagnosis and actually get the diagnosis and get treatment and get funding for it. So this is really interesting. This is helpful for funding, for treatment accessibility, but then also it causes over-pathologizing and over-diagnosing. Yeah, and sometimes it also caused that some of this is political and ideological potentially, that how we expand who will be diagnosed. So that's actually really interesting also. So there are some other specific changes, really. But one example is, for example, the DSM-5 included a disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, and this was really purely political. It's considered that. So basically, this disorder would allow children to be diagnosed with this, but then they wouldn't. In the earlier forms of the DSM, there was medication already given to children right away. It caused the conceptualization. So this would allow children. This was a wider diagnosis where kids could be treated and treated without medication also. So it also impacts treatment in that sense. Let's see. Also, another important change with DSM-5 is that it actually included for the first time behavioral disorders such as gambling. This was never done before that. So again, the author in our book, Fraser Carroll, talks about how much the word work is referenced. The author writes that the DSM-5 has the word work 400 times used. So it shows us how the whole orientation is geared toward productivity and social productivity and so forth. So DSM-5 had this in it. In 2019, DSM-5 started being developed, and again, a huge group of experts and um, started reviewing. And actually, there were uh, there were what they call four cross-cutting review groups. And this cross-cutting is actually an important term because we will use it in diagnosis as well. Cross-cutting, symptom, we look at different diagnoses, and so they use this conceptualization. Four cross-cutting review groups: culture, sex and gender, suicide, and forensic. So these groups looked at all the chapters and focusing on their expertise and gave feedback in terms of limitations and needing expansions or actually omissions that were needed. There was also another work group on ethno-racial equity and inclusion. Ethno-racial equity and inclusion. So this work group also reviewed DSM 5 and then gave feedback. So far, we're still connected to ICD-10 in the US, right? And then 2022, just a year and a half ago, ICD-11 was published. World Health Organization published ICD-11. And APA announced that we may utilize ICD-11 in 2025. We may start utilizing it to 2025. They're reviewing it. So there is this reviewing before we adopt it. We actually take it in. The DSM-5 TR got published March 2022. And so after this whole review of what I described to you by various different groups, there were a couple of important changes from our point of view. The term racialized started being used in DSM-5 instead of racial, to highlight the socially constructed nature of race. So racial is in itself as a term legitimizes maybe the conceptualization, but racialized actually gives us the meaning that this is an external conceptualized, constructed meaning. It's constructed, racialized. So that's really important. Ethno-racial was used in the DSM-5, and this overlaps with the current US census categories. The terms minority and non-white, they took those out because they describe social groups in relation to racialized majorities, and this kind of orientation continues to perpetuate. It perpetuates of course the discrimination. So DSM-5 TR started using the term Latinx instead of Latino, Latina. And this was an attempt to be inclusive in terms of gender inclusive terminology. The term Caucasian was left out because it's based on actually mistaken views on the geographic origin of people who of maybe European ancestry, but there's so much more complexity on the European ancestry, and so Caucasian just lumps everybody in, and actually as of course in reaction to non-Caucasian, right? So in relation to that, so this was being removed. DSM-5 also makes the TR, excuse me, DSM-5 TR also makes an attempt to name cultural norms that may affect the level of perceived pathology. So if I'm perceiving pathology, if I'm seeing, if I'm saying there is pathology here, there is a disorder here, this person is mentally ill, and I'm going to diagnose, that it actually invites, DSM-5 TR invites us to notice that this could be from my cultural views, normative views. So I need to also question that. Let's see, I need to end. We've been going too long. Children's experiences were included way more in DSM-5. So maybe another difference is DSM-5 TR only uses ICD-10, whereas the DSM-5 was using ICD-9 and 10. And then let's see. So maybe I will end here, and I'll do another brief lecture on some of the critiques on DSM, and then I can give you a little bit of the impact in the world and ICD history, all of that in another. So this will be 3 lectures, 1 long and 2 shorter lectures like this. Thank you for listening and engaging, and I'll bow to you as an end and see you soon.